Welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we're going to continue testimony on S325, and we have Paul Costello joining us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and it's an honor to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm an outsider to the building. I'm not close to 325. Is that the number? Excuse me. But deeply appreciate the work of the committee, wrestling with mental challenges to the future of Vermont. It's an honor to be here where you're diligently and effectively working to advance democracy in a very patriotic way, I think, for the future of Vermont, with all the challenges that we face. I was the executive director of the Vermont Council on Rural Development for 22 years. In that time, I think I probably managed more neutral facilitated community meetings than anyone in Vermont. One of the processes that we ran, and I'll give you a little bit of a description of some of that experience, but one of the processes we ran was the Council on the Future of Vermont, which we believed was the largest scale analysis of public values and priorities that's been done in the state of Vermont, certainly since the Cunin Commission of 1980 or so. The Council on the Future of Vermont did a deep evaluation of public values, asking people what we stood for as Vermonters, what were the core things that they wrestled with in their community, and what were the things that were most essential to preserve and protect as they look to the future of the state. The highest ranking value in that process, after interviewing 5,000 people in 113 different meetings around the state, was the statement, "I value the working landscape and its heritage." And we understood that to mean that they valued the land, and they also understood the heritage of stewardship by actively working individuals and businesses, farms, forest products businesses, and others who have produced the landscape that as a state we love, as people we love together. And so the policy work that you are doing in this committee seemed to me very much at the heart of that kind of work, in finding the correct balance points that bridge us together as Vermonters and also sustain and steward the land for the next generation. So again, it's an honor to be here and be part of that conversation. My experience is we've run community visits around the state. We've produced over 100 of those now with the towns from Bennington and Rutland to Pownell and Vernon, all across the state, where we run facilitated public meetings that engage 100 to 500 people looking at the future of the community. We have sessions on what's the vision for the future of this town, what are the challenges and opportunities, what are your good ideas to answer those challenges and opportunities, how do you prioritize those ideas, how do you take the priorities, turn them into an action plan. And we would do this with teams of 30 executive level state, federal, nonprofit officials that we would bring to these events, and then help them leverage resources to follow the community, because it's the communities that lead that get things done, and the resources of the state and fed don't lead, they respond and support. So again, I love my job. It was the greatest job in Vermont. We also ran 8 governors' retreats with governors of both parties. We're a neutral facilitator. We would run a retreat for an administration on what they could do to strengthen rural communities, how to advance broadband, how to advance the working landscape for the future. We ran 10 year-long policy councils. We built the first broadband council in the state of Vermont and took opinions from Vermonters all around the state about what was necessary, what were the policies that would drive broadband implementation. And we worked in that arena, facilitating processes for over 10 years, and certainly worked closely with the legislature through that period of time. We built 20 summits on everything from broadband and working lands to community leadership and COVID response. We built the Council on the Future of Vermont, the largest scale analysis of public values. We, in the end, were asked to work with to help manage the Governor's Efficiency Commission, and then to co-chair the Governor's Climate Action Council at the beginning of the climate efforts that the governor and this building were doing. And at one point, I was facilitating sessions of the Action Council and also facilitating sessions for the legislature in the climate working group that you developed. As a nonpartisan facilitator, it's not my job to tell people what direction they should go or to try to steer public policy, but to be an expert listener, a person in an organization that digests, does cluster analysis of ideas, adds up ideas, presents them back for prioritization, and stays out of the politics of implementation. Praise, never condemn, never criticize, never think we know better than the political process that represents us as a democracy. So a lot of experience in the arena of this kind of work. And I was asked to come in and share a couple reflections, and I'd much rather talk to you about where the situation at hand and where you are in terms of thinking about the need for or benefits, or even whether there's a use for public engagement around the issues that you've been facing. But first, I sort of asked to share a few principles and thoughts about how engagement processes work, just as some of my reflections, and then be glad to talk about what's on the table here. So the first thing is, the best kind of public engagement is based on the principle of neutrality. You can have an engagement that is a rally, you can have an engagement that is a reflection on particular ideas that you want information on. But the best engagement, where people feel ownership, is when they're asked at the beginning of a process, what do you stand for? What's your vision for the future? The facilitator in this kind of setting puts aside their own preconceptions and personal, social, and political beliefs to listen to every idea. And good engagement is about a deep listening process. It's about respect, that you respect every voice at the table. You respect people who are difficult to listen to, and you respect people that you already agree with, recognizing that the truth in any setting includes ideas like faces of a crystal from all those different kinds of people and all the different kinds of parties, and that representing them together in a holistic way is your job as a facilitator. That you do this not in a sort of slapdash, let's have a good conversation. You do it with a serious amount of discipline. You are providing serious meeting management that's precise to the purpose that you're working on, and fully transparent to participants. You don't have a session where you're brainstorming about something. Everyone's just throwing out ideas when you've already got a platform that everyone's looking at. You don't have a session on where people think they're making decisions at the table about a particular direction their community is making, when you're really just brainstorming and having an opening conversation about it. If you're not clear about where you are in the process and what the structure of the meeting is from the get-go of each meeting, you lose the faith and trust of communities. And in this work, as in politics, trust is the most important capital you can hold. So for us as an organization, and for us as facilitative partners in all kinds of projects, trust was always our foundation. Integrity, listening, telling the truth to everyone, and also hearing everything. That doesn't mean that everything is equal. In any conversation, there's wheat and there's chaff. And your job isn't to be the one to separate that, but you're contributing and adding up the voices so that things that are wheat tend to rise to the top. And oftentimes we would be running a prioritization session after big input, where we get 100 pages of notes from a bunch of sessions, and we would say, how do we bring back all the ideas we heard and give the community or the participant partners that we have, or particular stakeholders, the ability to go through these cluster analyzed ideas and evaluate which ones are the actual priorities for action, which ones are most important. Just a quick example, we're up in the town of Montgomery. They start talking about the need to attract youth, they need to attract housing, and they recognize we don't have any sewer capacity, so we can't actually build any housing in our village center. That's got to be our priority. But someone else says, I think our priority should be, we should work together to manage our everyone who's growing marijuana, we could all do it in one place and we could take turns making sure that it's safe. So we say, okay, we'll put that up on the wall. And inevitably that idea didn't become a priority of the community as a whole. But we heard that person had a voice and is it maybe an important person in that community, not for us to judge. So at any rate, we manage a process of sorting and prioritization that helps people move forward with practical action. So one of the most important things with this is that when you build a strong structure and you set up a disciplined pattern for facilitation and you ask a set of questions, you have to recuse yourself in faith to democracy. You have to have a sense that, there's goodwill here, that we're going to ask questions in a way that are going to look for positive directions. We're not going to ask questions that just let people come, like you think about how a select board meeting works, where people just come with their next problem, until there's a plate full of problems that doesn't go away. What you want to do is ask questions and facilitate a process that asks people what they're for. Where do you want to go? What are the things that you think could drive your community forward? Let's build that list and let's prioritize that list. And that list then becomes a ground for collective action within the community. So turning it away from just what you're against to what you're for is a fundamental of this. And then having faith that if you ask questions in the right way and you ask them to talk about what they aspire to, and you ask them what they share as points of vision, you tend to get pretty good product out of people, because actually most people want to help their community, want to help the state of Vermont move forward. So the other thing is that all content needs to be captured in a facilitated session. You need to scribe everything. You need to have it in the record so that people can read what they had to say. And then you have to do a cluster analysis of how things add up and then prioritize for action. But one of the most fundamental questions in any kind of engagement is, what are your goals? Why are you doing this engagement and what stage of the process? Sometimes we do a session around a project where people just wanted to build a vision sort of as a collective foundation, a consensus foundation for where process is going. And that's perfectly legitimate. Sometimes you're facilitating a brainstorm session to say, what are all the things we could do about this? Sometimes you're building a list of ideas towards action. So you're not just brainstorming, you're adding them up. You've got 10 things that you want to look at as potential action plans to think about how you drive them forward. Sometimes you're prioritizing. Sometimes you're taking a prioritized list and you're building a plan of action around each thing. Sometimes you already have an existing platform. You know where you're going and you're having a meeting to review that and think about any additions or anything you should be thinking about as you're moving that report. But I guess where I'm going is it's really important to know where you are and the purpose of your meetings in advance so that that's fully transparent to everyone who comes and you're acting and driving the conversation in that way. One example was probably 15 years ago, a commissioner of education in Vermont before the commissioner was a secretary, developed by himself a plan for unifying school districts throughout the state. And when he presented it to a couple of people, they were kind of nervous, very nervous right out front. And they said, we need to have a public dialogue about this. And so he went on the road and he did the public dialogue. The first couple of places he went with his public dialogue, people said, whoa, we know you've got a plan in your back pocket. And they felt they were being deceived and that they were being pushed. And they reacted very negatively, and it stalled him right out in terms of implementing anything for years. So it's all about letting people know where you are, you're gathering ideas, or are you, reflecting a platform where you want to have public consideration. You know, and then there are political meetings where you're really having a rally around a particular idea, and you don't care if opponents come so much. It's for a particular purpose. That's not the kind of facilitation I'm used to. But you know, there's all kinds of ways of doing this, and none of them are unfair or wrong or anything. You just need to be really clear with people in advance about the structure that you're going to use and how you're going to manage it. So in terms of management, there's a few things that are really important. Based on your decision in terms of your purpose of your meetings, you want to think about your systematic invitation. You know, is this a stakeholder session? Are you having a session that is really designed around bringing together the political and organizational interests that pertain to the topic at hand? Or is this for the general public? You want to invite as many people as you possibly can get together in a room to have this big conversation among patriotic Vermonters all together. And you need to decide that as part of your structure when you start. Because that's going to help you think about, well, how many meetings do we need to have? Where should they be located? You know, if you're trying to cover Vermont and around a policy question, you probably need 6 to 8 meetings in different parts of the state. You know, Franklin County, the Kingdom, Brattleboro, Bennington, Rutland, Springfield, or Montpelier. You know, you need to cover the state, make it so that no one's driving 100 miles to get to a public meeting. If you're having a public meeting, you have to be dedicated. If you're serious about the import of the meeting and you're taking public opinion for a hard purpose, you need to do a deep invitation. And that means you need to use every media resource online. You use Front Porch Forum, you use local press. You may get local leaders in the community to be your ambassadors to reach out to their community. You may get different legislators to help with that. But you use the media and all possible outreach sources so that it's a message that doesn't just go to the people who are already with you. In fact, when we're doing this work with the community and one of the issues is the future of the school, we say, yeah, why don't we build a list of people who you think of as opponents of the last school budget and personally invite all of them? You know, how do we reach out to people who have differences from us, but are part, you know, conservatives and liberals and right, left, and center who are part of this community and who are essential to us working together effectively in the future. So that process of invitation is really important. And the way you message the meeting it's got to be around that too. It's a fair, balanced center point with questions that can be answered multiple ways and that different people are going to see in different ways. And that's what you want. Deep invitation, structure of meetings, you know, there's lots of ways to structure these kinds of meetings. Part of it is around the discipline of having a facilitator who's strong enough to tell people to be quiet, who says, we've heard from you and it's really important, really got your point, really great point you've made, really appreciate it. We need to go on to someone else. And oftentimes as a facilitator, I'll choose someone I know and like and who talks too long and I'll say, all right. And I'll stop them and say, we want to keep our remarks brief. So sorry to put you on the point. But everyone, let's take note of this, that people should talk for a minute or less so that everyone in the hall has a chance to share a perspective. And so like being deliberate with humor and discipline to make sure that the former select board chair or the former town manager doesn't take over the floor and tell you, we've done that before. We tried it 10 times. We've wasted basically, they take the heart and soul out of the conversation for most people in the room because they're the old expert and they prevent fresh voices from sharing new ideas. And they act like the only legitimate thing is the former people in power. And we need to nurture everyone's feeling of ownership of a meeting and common direction, common purpose. We're all in it together. Everyone's been heard. And now you leave a meeting inspired by a sense of your community, inspired by a sense of power and opportunity that you can work with your neighbors to get this stuff moved forward and done. and by a sense that, yeah, I've been heard, and in fact, I've contributed to the answer. So the answers that are on the table are partly mine now. And that ownership is essential to progress. Communities that do this work really well are the communities in Vermont that you see really thriving and driving work forward. So you know, one of the things that there's lots of times where you have a meeting that's essentially around a political question that needs to be answered, or that has a body of information that everyone should know up front. And sometimes the best way to run a meeting where you have that situation is to have a quick presentation up front that shares the facts, and then you're done sharing facts. Otherwise, a meeting turns into a question and answer period and nobody owns anything. And you look to those who have the answers, whether you're against them or for them, that's probably not going to change over the course of the meeting because you aren't really getting a chance to express yourself. So, you know, it's a psychological dynamic that goes on in a meeting like this. I've sometimes thought of myself as more of a counselor than just a listener. You often say when no one speaks, you say, you know, I'm just like a counselor. I can stand up here all night. And everyone laughs and then they start talking. So let's see. So answering back is sometimes not a good idea. Sometimes it's better to just take it as all input and then evaluate it in a dispassionate way later, rather than trying to get into a debate or argument in front of the public, or set up some people as the people who know and make other people feel like they're not the ones that are on the inside. So, you know, as I think about how to structure, the other thing I think about is the questions you ask. You really don't want to have a meeting that's just about complaining. You know, you don't want to engage the public to tell you what's wrong. You want the public to tell you what they are for. So how do you do that? You ask questions that, instead of dividing the group into those who are for a platform or against the platform, you ask questions that are the next level up. You know, like you could ask, you know, what are our points of vision and values around the future of Vermont's landscape and the people and enterprises that are its stewards? You know, and that lets everyone have something to say, but it doesn't predict what they're going to say. And it also allows you to sort, but it doesn't turn people into supporters and opponents of a particular platform or work. The other kinds of questions, and often I find that actually 3 questions are really useful. It's really nice to have a rhythm to it and say, okay, we got that. We're going to come back to, you see on your page, so the next question is this. So let's save that and come back with more on that from you. I really appreciate your point. But you build a rhythm that goes from something that's somewhat visionary to something that's very practical. Like, what are your practical ideas about how to drive this work forward? What are the practical things that you think, if there was legislation about this topic, what are the ideas you think should be considered in that legislation? We're not making any decisions here tonight. We're just getting ideas on the table, everybody. And the legislature's got to do what the legislature's got to do. That's a political process. They have their work. But what our job is just to throw as many ideas out to give them, you know, a banquet of thought that they can play with as they're working their way forward. And then you might ask people in a third question based on, they've already talked about their visions for the future, and they've already talked about their ideas to enhance and drive public policy in this particular arena. And the third thing you might ask is something more like, you know, are there principles or priorities in this? Are there clear things that, of everything we've heard from everybody, that you think stand out as fundamental to the way this issue is approached in the future? And it gives a slightly different aspect to how people can respond. And I'm just using these as examples. Usually when you're working in this kind of way, you are working with a partner organization that's got where you have an agenda, a larger agenda that you're working from, and you're asking for opinion about something that you want to be driving forward one way or another. So, so you invent those questions in a sort of rhythm way that leaves everyone feeling, well, that was a great meeting. Or they're standing, you see a meeting where the meeting's over and everyone's standing around talking. because they still have more to say. They're excited, they're engaged, and they feel like, wow, something's happening here. And you really like to leave people with that sense. And then you respond to them. So you send transcripts back to everyone who signed in with their email address. You stay in touch with them. Or here's where this has gone in terms of the statewide platform that's come from this. And you build partners that may come from both sides of the aisle, may come from rich and poor, from really across the Vermont constituencies. And so that, so like, as I think about where you are, I don't really know if there's, I understand that that you're looking at eliminating parts of 181 that don't have consensus out of the building or in the building, and that you're looking at potential for next stage. And I guess as I would think about this, I'd be interested about, what kind of facilitation what kind of public engagement might be useful. What are the kinds of questions that you are left with? And what does it contribute to in terms of a direction? Is there another stage of work that you would look to fulfill? And if not, part of me is very cautious about engaging the public when you're not sure what you want, because otherwise you're just stirring up. And if the public comes and contributes and feels like nothing comes of it, it's dispiriting to them, or they get a negative perception. So, I'm not here as an advocate. I'm not close to the political work that you folks have been doing, and I don't have any recommendations on where you should proceed. And so I'm sorry I've gone so long going through some of these details of how things work in advance of knowing fully where you are. But that's what I have to share. And I'd be glad to think through or talk with you about your either questions or perspectives on ways that public engagement could be useful in your current circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I guess I'm kind of left with a question that may be too big, but have you thought about how the role of this legislature fits into the public discourse? And I know that, you've demonstrated and told us about the depth and breadth of your experience, and you've worked for the legislature. Maybe it would help to kind of hone in on how that happened, or where in the process the previous engagement that you mentioned happened, or just just your thoughts on where the legislature fits into the public process.
It's a good question. We've engaged with the legislature regularly. When I was first hired in 2000, there was no broadband committee in the state of Vermont, and we went to Doug Racine, who was the lieutenant governor, and talked to committee chairs from several committees who recognized the importance of broadband, but didn't really there was no platform thinking going on. And they asked us to help develop ideas and bring ideas to legislative committees. And so we did that. Most often the VCRD board, and certainly the work that we do with communities where we invite legislators to participate, has always been deliberately a step away from political alliances, left or right, and we had a firewall in between us and electoral politics. So we would never comment on candidates. I never made a political contribution or attended a candidate event for 22 years because of our sense that how important that distance was. We would not allow legislators on our board. We recognize this is a community level process. It contributes to, and it helps to build a authorizing environment, as often people use the word authorizing environment for political action. But we didn't want to criticize or be in a position to think that any of this was superior to the work that goes on in this building. So we did the climate economy study, and pulled together a, 800-person climate partnership of people who looked at, instead of looking at the tragedy of climate change and its dire implications, we said, how are we going to respond effectively as a state? And in terms of responding to climate change, but also to the world competition for creative and adaptive economic development strategies that are actually going to win the next stage of global competition. So let's think of it in terms of that. How do you win in global competition by answering climate change rather than just than the work that many others are doing? And to do that, we didn't do it as an advocacy organization like VNRC or VPIRG. That's never been our role. But instead, we pulled together leading experts from the economic development world, from key businesses like Beta Technologies and others who are in their infancy, to say, what is the platform of action that could be successful? And then we would bring those kinds of reports to the governor and to the legislature with recommendations for action that we would champion, but never criticize, because the political process had its own way of digesting this work, and it wasn't our job. We weren't an advocacy organization. And so I kind of still am in that setting. And so, if I was invited by Bernie Sanders to help facilitate a town meeting event, I would have said, no, we never did that. Much as he may have had a good agenda at the time, it wasn't our role. So, I'm not here looking for work, for one thing. And it may be that the committee itself would want to run hearings in some way. It's hard when you look around the table to say, who's the politically neutral group to manage and lead a conversation like this in Vermont today? I'm not sure. I've talked to a lot of people about the goals of 20 by 30 for conservation, and 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. And you say, gosh, someone should be bringing together all the partners that are engaged in that work to help them internally build plans for how they're going to work effectively together at scale. And then you think about education reform or healthcare, and you say, who steps back and in a disinterested way shares, frames out and listens to the people and brings back a set of potential opportunities for legislators to think through that could advance this issue to the next level. And in some ways, VCRD took that role for good or ill. Maybe we were imperfect, but we tried, and we did it with good intentions, good heart. And also, we always were able to connect with brilliant people. So when we asked someone to serve on that Climate Action Commission or on a commission on COVID response, they would always say yes. And they would know that it would be well managed and that their inputs would be consolidated and it would be practical, and that it would also listen to the people, and that we weren't going to be involved in political advocacy. So there's many ways to do this. And, the other thing I'd say as an outsider, it's challenging to think about how you do public engagement from legislative seats in an election year, where you're going to be doing some of that in the electoral cycle and in the way you meet with your constituencies. And that's natural to the democratic process, but it's separate from the way that we would engage in the past. Maybe there's ways to do it, but that would be separate from the kinds of things that I know about.
Other questions? Representative Austin.
Were you involved in the Futures report, the Futures Project report? Were you involved in
We did the Council on the Future of Vermont, and then we built this process called Propositions for the Future of Vermont, which we started before COVID, and it kind of ran into the COVID wall. And basically, the governor asked us if we would chair the commission for the community side of COVID response. And we devoted all our staff time for 2 years to that. To just communicating, building coalitions and connecting people at the community leadership level who are answering COVID challenges in their towns, and then ultimately nonprofits and executive level folks in state government to help coordinate what they were doing without any top-down power to do that.
So where does data and science come into this? That's one question. And then the other one is when you're looking at public input, how do you know the trends? Do they really jump out that you can see that in this whole conversation, a lot of people are kind of saying the same thing in different ways?
It's a great question. Well, that's a great questions, both of them. So when we would evaluate, we'd take a topic like broadband, we'd do an analysis of existing, where broadband is rolled out, where it hasn't rolled out, what are the market impediments in those areas. So we would do that data research, and often we would contract with an external partner. Sometimes the Department of Geography at UVM, the Center for Rural Studies at UVM, other partners, and we'd raise money to both pay ourselves and to pay contractors to do that kind of work. The other side was about this.
Well, I guess what I'm asking about science is like people, just being on a planning commission, people come up with great ideas, but their ideas, when you look at the reports, if you read the reports that, you would on a planning commission, the public might not, but you realize it's like, either this is going to cost way too much money or it's just their ideas are not going to work.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm kind of asking. How do you, take input from people and then where they won't feel like you weren't really listening because the data doesn't support,
Well, it's a great question. And there's times where that's just, that's true. And not only the data, but people they share their ideas, and their ideas really aren't very closely connected to what the majority of people in that community seem to want. In some processes, like the Council on the Future of Vermont, we did massive polling. We contracted and spent a fair amount of money we first we held probably 20 meetings with people around the state to say, what are Vermont values now in this stage of our state? And then after we'd heard over and over the same ones, we added up what we'd heard, and then we took polling results on those to identify which ones were actually the great majority of Vermonters supported, and we built our internal framework based on that.
Representative Chapin.
Thanks, Paul. This is wonderful to hear about and somewhat close to your work at certain times, and really appreciate how unique BCRD is in the landscape. I'm curious about your thoughts after a couple decades in this about sort of majority rules. And so when you're doing that kind of cluster analysis, or surveys, you're really looking at what does the majority say? And just wondering how you balance that with the needs of particular groups of people that are often in the minority, or how you balance sort of, ideas with values. Well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself and imagining that what you need to do is focus more on values than concrete ideas of things to do when you're trying to look at how things might impact or have unintended consequences on really important populations that are often in the minority.
That's a great question and a complex one, as you must be wrestling with it here all the time. When you're working with community, partly it starts with invitation to make sure that you're not just bringing together the well-off people who have always set the agenda. And so you do a really deep process. We actually have like if we're doing community engagement at scale, we have a steering committee of 30 folks that we identify going place to place, who would best represent some of the low income community. What about this neighborhood? Do we have people of color in this community that should be on it? So there's a deep process that you evaluate as well as business leaders and someone from the select board and others, so that you have a balanced group that's framing the questions with you. It's not just you as outsiders saying, well, here's what the questions should be for your community. And here's what we're going to call your process and all that. But yeah, inevitably, the majority of people that come are driving towards their, they've had a values conversation, and often it includes, and in many communities will have a diversity, equity, and inclusion question, one form or another, about the future of the economy. How do we spur justice in the work that we do as a community and so forth? So that usually has happened pretty thoroughly as they're then selecting priority ideas that come from the list. Often those ideas are around, they range from building a communication strategy so that all the working groups in town are part of the same working network and we know each other, to water and sewer plant, housing development, community daycare center, whatever it is. And so it's inevitable that there's a constant tension around that. And then there are minority ideas where we have seen people, before there's a prioritization process, say, hey, what the heck? We don't need this process to decide. We're just going to do this. And you'll have 5 or 6 people go out and say, well, we're going to build an arts council in Cabot, or we're going to build a daycare center in Craftsbury. We already know now. And they just do it. So it's not like there's power over in any way in this kind of a process. It's sort of like identifies communities of the willing, and yet there's not a top-down structure that says, for a small group, we didn't have the capacity to say, and so what is it that you folks want? And so I don't know exactly how you deal with that. You have to just constantly be working to do your best.
Representative Morris,
Thank you.
are you ready?
Yes, yeah, I think. Paul, thanks for the discussion, and mine's going to be relative. We have a couple of bills before us. S325, which is the Act 181 review. H955, which is the education. We spoke to education a little while ago. It seems like the baby buggy's heading down the road, and public trust has been lost somewhere, and the wheels are starting to fall off the buggy. How, through the process, what recommendations or thoughts do you have? And maybe you alluded that earlier in your discussion, but how do we start putting the baby buggy wheels back on and gaining back public trust?
It's a great question. And it's sort of the question of our country. It's the question, how do we overcome the divisiveness and the fact that the internet and the memes and the way that everyone has an instant judgment on everything because they've seen a flash on it 10 seconds online, and everyone's given permission to be their worst selves in public. All those things have put us in a situation where the first things people say about any idea are negative. And we have built, maybe the 50s was a boosterish society. We're a negating society. And I think that's the fundamental challenge to us as citizens to overcome that. Like, patriotism isn't just winning a war, it's winning each other. It's winning the democracy back. So in this setting, I guess my question would be, as you think about the purpose of public engagement, there may be some things where you've come through a political process and the political decision's over, and you don't really need to take public engagement time around something that's passed. That you really, it would depend to me on what's your next agenda? What's your aspiration? And if the aspiration is one where you want to really look at the future of the larger bill of 181 and say, what are the other things we should do to enhance and support the the areas that are most important for us to preserve and protect in the future of Vermont? Or, like, what's the question that you would ask that you would want to engage the public on, that you're going to be working on, and that would provide fodder to you in advance of framing before you have a framework? One of the things I often feel is that nobody buys an imposed vision. If they're involved in thinking with you and putting their points of vision together, then it becomes their vision too. And it doesn't need to be power politics. It's more like everyone can be in it. And the more we do that sort of exercise, the better our muscles are for it. And the more the public feels engaged in advance. And I think that can undermine some of the negativity. I think education, I was involved with a circle of legislators when the first consolidation bill was produced, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, where the Speaker of the House was looking to save money, and the plan was that saving money would be most effective if done with consolidation. And so framing a consolidation platform would be the answer to some of the fundamental long-term challenges of the budget impasse that we had even then. I'm not for or against consolidation. When I think as a facilitator, I think, well, what works best? And let's have that conversation. At that time, a House bill was developed, and there was a lot of talk about the need for a much deeper public conversation in advance. And, when I look at the issue of budgets and governance, I'm sorry to say this, but I think that it's like you're told to look for the diamond ring that your wife lost underneath the lamppost, because that's what you know. Where she lost it in the backyard in the woods, right? But you look under the lamppost of governance and budget, because that's the primary responsibility you have towards outcomes. And that's what you have to drive to, is having a successful budget passage that sets the state in motion for the next round of work. But the problem is something like education. Vermonters needed a conversation around the vision and values that we uphold in a democracy for the future of every child and every community in the state. And what are the changes in education that we're going through now that could open new opportunities for kids to understand the global learning opportunities that are there? If the kids can learn Chinese online now, how do we open that world? How do we think about the appropriate curriculum for kids in the future? And then how do we think about how we effectively do that work and produce those kinds of opportunities for all kids? What does the model of a school system look like in that context? What's it going to cost? And how do we budget for it, right? So that conversation just started at the wrong end. And there was a movement in the legislature that tried to turn that over. They actually wanted VCR to do it. I don't know that we were sophisticated enough to do that kind of thing at the kind of scale that was required. But it never happened. And so, from the outside, you see the same conversation struggling in a very similar way. And you say, are we answering this long-term values question in a way that activates Vermonters to feel they're all on the same page and they understand the value proposition of the outcome plan that the legislature's produced, right? Because nobody's ever tied it all together. We're not really saying we're going to, we may be improving curriculum. We may be doing this. We may be saving money. We're doing this. And so rural Vermont, how do they feel? They feel done to. And they feel talked down to, and they feel like their teachers aren't respected and their school boards aren't respected. And it's nobody's intent to be that way. There's no one to, but you can't deny that people feel that way, right? So it puts you in an ongoing conundrum, even though everyone's working with the best of intentions. And so I'm not sure, and you are much closer to this and a much better place to judge the meaning and value of an engagement process today based on where you are, or on the future of education based on your faith in the current trajectory of education work. But I've seen towns transform themselves. I've seen public policy advance in striking new ways because of good facilitated processes. And I think we can do better. And I think that I think there's ways to do this sort of stuff. You know, and none of that is in any way saying that I don't have just the utmost respect for the work that the legislature and governor, everybody who's playing a part in our system of divided government. You know, from the inside, it looks like the Senate's against the House and the governor's against both and all that. But thank God, thank God we have that kind of a structure where there's a balance of power and you're thinking together. In the end, you'd come to fairly good outcomes. And maybe that, as Madison and others designed constitutions, that was their hope, was good balanced government rather than utopian solutions to problems. So anyway, I'm just
Representative Chapin.
reaching.
I know we want to wrap up, so just a really quick question. So I think you've covered this a little bit, but maybe not specifically. I'm presuming that a really good, well-facilitated process comes up with different ideas that often work better than when that doesn't exist. And I guess I'm just curious, in your experience, is that part of the outcome, not just better trust and buy-in, but actually better functional solutions?
I'd say yes. But I'd say, you know, if you look at, it's like you look at a town and what they're struggling with, you can kind of guess there's 2 or 3 things that you already sort of know that would benefit. But the amazing thing is how there'll be a couple of things you never would have thought of, and how they surprise you, and how they inspire you, and how they come from people. You know, we're in Johnson doing this work, and there's this guy who's very difficult for people to listen to. He's cranky. He's probably cranky all the time in town. By the end of our sessions, we were exhausted. But I can just imagine the select board. But he kept batting on the wall of housing, and people got to where they didn't want to hear it. And in the end, we managed him so that he didn't dominate meetings. And when people came around to prioritize what was going to be good for their community, they identified working together to develop new housing for low-income folks in the village center as a core priority. And they did it because the issue was depersonalized. They heard him and they recognized a certain truth, and they made decisions on what the community should stand for. And they built it. They renewed a bunch of housing in the downtown that are show places of good neighborhood development right in the downtown. And it was inspiring to see. The other thing that lots of communities will, and this is community scale, not legislative scale, but lots of communities wrestle with stuff like, we have the veterans group that meets, and it has its own invitation list. We have an arts group. We have our municipal government with all its connections, and they have their own circle of people who pay attention. We have the college up on the hill, and we have the high school, and all these different groups have their own email lists, their own invitation lists. And at one meeting, we had this kid get up and say, I look around and I just think we live in our bubbles as a community, and we're becoming communities within a community, and the whole town doesn't get together for anything. And it was just such a wise thing for a 14-year-old kid to say. And everyone said, well, let's do something about that. And they decided to build a communications committee. And the communications committee sat down, and it was great because they have a college radio station, they have a newspaper, they have all these different communications. And they got together and they said, we don't want to just communicate about communicating. Let's do something that unites all of our vehicles of communication to build one community, and let's build events that we then celebrate and use all our invitation lists together. So they started a Thursday Night Live on the Green in town, and they had hip hop dancing with kids from school. One week they had a country music from the veterans group. The next week they had theater from the arts community, and they all invited everyone. And it became the thing that the families would go down with their picnic baskets, and seniors would go, and kids would go, and everyone went. And it bridged in practice. And you say, what's that worth? Like, that doesn't drive the economy. But if you're looking at the future of Vermont, you're looking at the competition, the global climate competition to attract creative youth. Creative young people are going to drive, they're going to be the enterprise leaders of our future. And so all that stuff is infinitely valuable. The other thing that's valuable is anyone who goes to any town, they want to have a sense if your town is confident, is growing, is got a sense of optimism and hope, or if it's flat. And if it's flat, they're going to be looking at it in competition with towns that they think are dynamos, and because they want that for their children. So, you know, Vermont has to do what it is within its power, and it's not all just economic development.
Thank you
So,
so
sorry
much
to
for
preach.
joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That was great. Thank you. Members, let's take a 5-minute break. I know